Welcome, everyone. My name is Morgan McLeod, and I'm the Communications Manager at the Sentencing Project. Thank you all so much for joining our online book discussion presented by the Sentencing Project's campaign to end life imprisonment. Our campaign to end life imprisonment was launched in December, and we are working with advocates around the country to promote policies that limit life imprisonment. I encourage you all to check out our campaign website at www.endlifeimprisonment.org, where you'll find information on life sentences in America, stories about people impacted by life imprisonment, and campaign news and events. We are really interested in hearing from people and partnering with organizations to spread this movement, so please be in touch if you're interested in joining our campaign. Today, we are here to discuss our new book, The Meaning of Life, The Case for Abolishing Life Sentences by Executive Director Marc and Senior Research Analyst Ashley Nellis. The Meaning of Life documents the expansion of life sentences in the United States and argues that such extreme punishments are in fact counterproductive for public safety. The book also features moving profiles of 6 people affected by life sentences written by Kerry, who was incarcerated for 27 years and is now the Deputy Executive Director at the Louisiana Parole Project. The authors will also be joined, you will hear from all 3 authors today, as well as Sam Lewis, Director of Inside Programs at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in California, whose compelling story was profiled in The Meaning of Life. There will be a Q&A after this presentation. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation or by using the webinar panel on your right. There's a section inside where you can type in your questions. The webinar is recorded and will be posted online afterwards. So to begin, I will hand things off to Ashley Nellis, our Senior Research Analyst.
Hi, everybody. Just give me one moment. And hopefully everybody can see me. Thanks very much for Morgan for kicking us off. And I'm really excited to be here with Marc and my other colleagues to talk with you today about life sentences and the main parts of our book, The Meaning of Life, The Case for Abolishing Life Sentences. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about how we came to write this book and some of the national and state-based trends over time that have brought us to where we are today with 1 in 7 people in prison serving a life sentence. So Marc's and my interest primarily in life sentences comes from our own personal experiences with coming to know people serving life sentences. Marc, at the beginning of his career in Michigan, came to know a number of lifers in the Michigan prison system there, and I came to know a number of lifers serving sentences for crimes committed when they were juveniles after I started the Sentencing Project. And I would say that our lasting impression for both of us was the stark contrast between the crimes that they had committed and the people that they had eventually become. And for both of us, that just struck us as really an important component to crime policy and to corrections policy. So our work sort of started there. As an organization, we're of course known for our reliability and our reliance on data to inform crime policy and to answer the tough questions about criminal justice and sentencing policy. So our first sort of approach to this issue was to try to answer the question, how many people are serving life sentences? And so we first did this in 2003 after discovering that unfortunately there were no substantial and consistent data collection efforts to document how many people were serving life sentences. One was done by the American Corrections Association in 1984, and another was done in 1992 by Bureau of Justice Statistics. But other than these two sort of random data efforts, there was no systematic way that data were collected, and so we started that effort with a data collection and ultimately a report that came out in 2004. I want to show you here is a culmination of the data that we've collected over time. And over time, you can see that there's been a pretty substantial growth in the number of people serving life sentences, starting at the beginning in 1984, when 34,000 people were documented to be serving life sentences, to 2016. There's been a nearly five-fold increase in life sentences. And you'll see that there is this yellow bar that indicates virtual life, which is a more recent category of life sentence that we've started collecting data on. Those are people who are serving sentences that are likely to amount to the rest of their life in prison. And we make this cutoff at 50 years. So for each of these years, 2003, again in 2008, 2012, and 2016, we collected data from each of the states and the federal government on the number of people serving life sentences. And so we produce this just so that you can see how it's expanded over time. One of the things that we've discovered is that since the first national count, where we had 34,000 people serving life sentences, we've seen this nearly five-fold increase, and that this has even outpaced the non-life prisoner count, which has tripled in size over this same period of time. And then looking more deeply into the lifers, people serving life sentences that have the opportunity of parole versus those who don't have the opportunity of parole, we see that the category, the harshest category of life sentence, those who have absolutely no opportunity for parole, has grown the most rapidly, showing a 59% increase in life without parole between 2003 and 2016, and now accounting for about 53,000 people incarcerated. Every state in the union and the federal government use life sentences. They have it, they allow for it. In many states, it's a required sentence based on certain convictions, and in every state they use it. There are a range of, percentages within the prison population that are serving life, from a low of 5% or so, 6% in North Dakota, to more than 30% in states like Louisiana, Utah, and California. And all of this amounts to 1 in 7 people on average in prison serving a life sentence. About 14% of the prison population now has a life sentence. People often ask, what did people do to get a life sentence? The vast majority of people have committed a serious and violent crime. Not as high as people might think, though. Only about 60% have committed a homicide, and 40% have a non-homicide offense that's resulted in their life sentence. There's racial disparities in the life sentence population, not surprising considering the entire criminal justice system is slanted toward capturing more African Americans than not. And so we find that 1 in 5 African Americans who's in prison today is serving a life sentence. And then finally, on the issues of gender, women make up a small proportion of people serving life sentences, as they do with all prison sentences. About 3% of lifers are women. One thing that we're watching carefully on this as we continue to collect data, though, is that women are the growth of women serving life sentences is happening more rapidly than the growth of men. In fact, about twice as rapidly. One area that's gotten a fair amount of attention is the juveniles, who have received Supreme Court rulings in their favor 3 times in the last 10 years. And all of this has dealt with a category of lifer, the people serving life without parole. But when we include those serving life with parole and those serving life virtual life sentences, we now know that about 12,000 people are serving some form of a life sentence in our system that is results from a crime they committed when they were under the age of 18. So I want to share with you another question that comes up to us frequently, which is, but we saw this decline in crime and this rise in life sentences. So isn't the rise in life sentences, isn't that what explains the decline in violent crime? And here we join with scholars in the field that almost universally agree, scholars such as those from the National Academy of Science and others that say that it's the policies rather than crime that has driven these trends. And so when we're talking about policies, we're talking about sort of the usual policies that we have grown to critique because of their negative impact on the criminal justice system and on the American public just generally. These are policies like mandatory minimums, which often include mandatory life sentences or mandatory 25 years on a life sentence before parole review. Systems that have abolished parole altogether. So there's about a dozen or so jurisdictions, including the federal government, that has gotten rid of its parole system for lifers altogether. Also the use of habitual offender laws, so that by the time you have your second or third felony, you're put away for life regardless of your potential for reform or even sometimes the seriousness of those felonies. And then finally, the rapid transfer of juveniles into the adult system that happened mostly during the 1990s that made young people susceptible to life sentences, and in 29 states made them vulnerable to a mandatory life sentence. So we see these laws as having a particularly consequential effect on people who are now serving life sentences. And I'll turn the screen back over to Morgan, or over to Marc or Morgan to take it from here and talk a little bit about the public policy, the public safety and aging out issues that we also address in our book.
Thank you, Ashley. Now we will hear from our Executive Director, Marc Maurer. Marc, if you can share your screen and unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks very much, Morgan. Yes, we're pleased to join everyone talking about these important issues. I want to focus a bit on what the implications of life imprisonment are, both for mass incarceration and for public safety. We're at a moment right now, certainly over the past decade, where there's growing momentum in critiquing the scale of incarceration. We've seen significant changes, reductions in prison populations in a number of states. Now the federal government passing some legislation to help with that as well. But still the scale of decarceration is relatively modest across the board, given the development of mass incarceration over 40 years. In many jurisdictions, we also know that policymakers have been looking for what they sometimes describe as the low-hanging fruit. That is, people convicted of lower-level drug offenses, lower-level property offenses, and trying to divert those people into community supervision and services, all of which, of course, is the right thing to do. But if we truly want to end mass incarceration, it's not going to happen unless we look at these excessive sentences that we see, both with life imprisonment as well as sentences of 30, 40, 50 years in prison as well. Life imprisonment is also problematic because it contributes to increasing the severity of prison terms across the board. The reason it does that, life imprisonment along with the death penalty, is that sentencing systems of any kind are always proportional. So murder is punished more severely than robbery, which in turn is punished more severely than burglary and car theft. Well, the challenge in the United States with the death penalty and life without parole at the top of the sentencing structure is that they exert an upward pressure on sentences across the board in making them proportional. And this is part of the reason why sentences, even for lesser offenses, are more severe in the US. If you're sentenced to prison for a third-time car theft in the US, you're going to spend more time in prison than you would for the same offense in England, Italy, Germany, and most other industrialized nations. So there's that challenge as well. We also argue in our book that life imprisonment is counterproductive for public safety, which sounds counterintuitive at first, but this is largely based on the fact that criminologists have known for a long time that people age out of the high crime rate years. What we can see is that involvement in crime begins to rise in the mid-teens, a higher risk. Being involved in criminal activities that rises through the late teens and early 20s, and then starts to decline quite rapidly after that. Here we can see some of the data for the crime of robbery, looking at people involved in robbery, arrested for that. As we can see, the crime rates go up significantly in those early years, come down, so that by the time people are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and certainly 60s and 70s, they're much less of a risk for public safety than they were at 19 or 22 or so. This contributes as well to being counterproductive for public safety because it results in diverting resources for more effective public safety strategies. As people age in prison, we're getting diminishing returns for public safety with each successive year that they're behind bars, and it comes at an increasingly greater cost because we know that keeping elderly people behind bars can cost at least twice that of younger people, particularly for rising costs of health care. So since public safety resources are finite, we only have so much to invest, we need to think about how we allocate those funds to be most effective. And by expanding the number of life sentences tremendously, we reduce our ability to intervene with the 14, 15, 16-year-olds who are beginning to get into trouble, and we could intervene in ways that would be far more effective for public safety purposes. All of this analysis leads us to propose in our book that we would have a much more rational, much more compassionate system of sentencing if we capped prison terms at a maximum of 20 years, except in unusual circumstances. Now, this may sound like a fairly provocative statement in policy to many, but if we were in Western European nations, it would not be at all provocative, because in most nations in Western Europe, either by statute or in practice, there are relatively few people who serve more than 20 years in prison. So our proposal for doing this, again, is based on the public safety aging out of crime rationale, that 20 years after someone's been incarcerated, in most cases they are at much less of a public safety risk than the day that they were sentenced to prison. We know this also because of lifers who are released on parole, usually in 30s, 40s, and 50s or so. Their rates of recidivism are generally considerably below that of the general prison population. So again, we're getting diminishing returns for public safety. People will sometimes say, well, but not everyone has transformed themselves after 20 years in prison, and that's correct. I think there are two things we need to note here. First, on the day that a person is sentenced in prison, there's no one in the courtroom, judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, anyone else, who can predict what that person will be like 20 years from now. So we need to look at who the person is at that time, not on the day of sentencing. We propose that in unusual circumstances, for public safety reasons, if a correction system has reason to believe that a person is still a significant risk after 20 years in prison, that there could be additional periods of confinement. The country of Norway does them in 5-year increments, where the idea is during a 5-year period, the system will provide as much as it can in terms of rehabilitation services, preparation for release, reducing the risk level of that person in prison. The burden should be on the correction system to demonstrate there's a significant public safety risk, and this is a means by which we could find the exceptional cases that would allow us to let the system run smoothly. So 20 years is a maximum prison term we think is eminently defensible. If we move towards this, we have a significant impact on reducing the prison population, and we'd also free up substantial resources that would allow us to invest in more effective crime control strategies. Thanks.
Thank you, Marc. Now I want to bring Sam Lewis into the conversation. Sam, if you can please share your screen and unmute yourself. Hi.
Hello.
You were profiled in The Meaning of Life because you were impacted by life imprisonment. You were sentenced to life with parole at age 18 in California, which has one of the largest life with parole populations in the country. Can you share with the audience a little bit about your experience of incarceration?
Certainly. So thank you. First, let me kind of take you back a little bit of how I ended up incarcerated. So there's a saying that hurt people, and more often than not, people that have gone through significant trauma or bad experiences when they were children often don't find the type of therapy that's necessary in order for them to overcome and change how they see the world based on that trauma that they've experienced. So for me, from the age of birth till 7, I lived in a regular family home, a mom and a dad, siblings. During my 7th year of age, I walked into the house with my younger sister, and there was a huge commotion. And we literally walked into my dad beating my mom. My dad was 6'2", 215 pounds. My mom was 5'1", a small, petite lady. And there was nothing that we could do to stop him. We tried. That was my first experience of trauma. From there, my dad left the house, wasn't really in my life for the rest of my life. So as I got older, I started having problems in school. And a lot of it I can articulate now was the pain, frustration, and lack of having a father and not knowing how to verbally articulate that to my mother or even to staff in the schools, teachers and coaches. I was really angry, and I was angry towards any authority figure. And that was because my father was the authority figure that I grew up with in the house. Fast forward to I'm a teenager. I grew up in South LA during the height of the gangs and the crack epidemic. And I looked for those male role models that any young kid would want in their life. Mine came in the form of gang members and hustlers and all the things that were negative in my community. And I found acceptance with that group. When I would allow my anger to take over what I was doing, I would get the accolades that I wanted, that I really wanted from my father. Eventually, I committed a horrible crime as a teenager in furtherance of the game. I committed murder in the name of my gang, and I was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. I was a high school dropout. I could barely read and write, with a whole bunch of anger on the inside and no clear direction. And when I ended up in the Department of Corrections in California, at that time, there were not a lot of rehabilitative programs. Prison, as is defined in our statutes, is meant for punishment. And I was fine with that because I was hopeless. I didn't see hope at the end of the road for me, or down the tunnel, so to speak. So while inside, I continued down that same track with gangs and doing all of the negative things, and found myself in what's called a security housing unit, isolation, multiple times for 2- and 3-year increments. Isolation being 23 hours a day, 1 day out, no human touch, far away from home. And it did no good to change how I was thinking. Eventually, in my 7th year of incarceration, as I was scheduled to have a visit with my daughter, who was born a month after I was arrested. I was sitting behind a glass holding cell for administrative segregation of the SHU, and my daughter had never seen me handcuffed like this. And she just wanted to know why she couldn't hug me. She literally was scared, and she asked me, she said, "Dad, why are you back there?" And I said, "Because I got in trouble." And she said, "Well, can you not get in trouble so the next time I come to see you, I can hug you?" And it literally made me want to change in that moment. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I was on the maximum security yard. I still had months to go in the security housing unit. And I just looked at her and fought back tears and told her I promised I would try. So that put me on a path 7 years into my sentence to want to try, but I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to change. All I knew was gangs, hustling, and the things that I grew up with in my community. And in prison, those things were just added to. You have plenty of gangs and plenty of negative influences. And I found one particular program that caught my eye called Alternatives to Violence. And I enrolled in that program. I went through some workshops, and it started teaching me a different way of thinking. With the support and encouragement of my mom, I started also pursuing my education. So she asked me if I thought about actually finishing high school. I went back, I completed my GED, and I wanted to go further in school. So eventually I enrolled in college. At that time, in the Department of Corrections, there were college programs funded by Pell Grants. So my first 4 college programs were available inside the Department of Corrections before the funding was started. But it opened a window into my mind that where I could see the world differently. So I continued to search for a way to continue to pursue my education, and I did this through correspondence courses. And while doing this, I also realized that there was a lot of internal work that I needed to do, because I still was angry and I didn't understand where my anger came from. I didn't fully understand why I had so much resentment towards authority figures. It was just I would wake up in prison angry, and I started asking myself, why am I so mad at the world? I met a doctor named D.N. Tony while I was in Soledad Correctional Facility, and I asked her for counseling. And this is something that's not popular. Therapy is not popular. At that time, wasn't popular, but I wanted to understand me. So she arranged for me to go through a different program called the Victims Offenders Education Group, and this literally helped me look back through my childhood and all of the years of gangs and trauma and start understanding how that made me see the world and how I approached the world and why I was angry at authority figures. And it also put me on the track to start understanding that I need to do some forgiving. These programs were like hard to come by, hard to find, hard to get into, but I really, really want to get involved. And once I got down this track on really being involved in rehabilitative programs, it helped me start understanding myself, and it helped me to heal. Eventually, I helped create programs inside a couple of facilities, and it started shifting the way some of us thought. One of the things that I like to say, while inside, the culture on some of the yards started to shift because of some of the programs that we started to create. But this wasn't true of the entire system. What I found true, and what I found true with many, many other lifers, was that we all felt as though we had been basically thrown away. No one believed that we could change. No one believed that we could become different people, and that was entirely different as I sit before you today. To date, in the state of California, mainly through Governor Brown, over 5,000 life prisoners have been released, and the recidivism rate for that particular number of life prisoners is less than 1% to this date. That's been consistent across the board. In regards to going to the parole board, for me, I went to the parole board 8 times. On my 9th time, I was found suitable. Going to the parole board is most people believe that if you go to the parole board, you automatically get out with good behavior. That's not true. Our parole board for a long time in California was really politicized. Less than 1/2 of 1% of lifers would ever get released in a year. Literally, it was like a lottery. If you saw a lifer go home prior to Governor Schwarzenegger, actually, it was a surprise. You might see one lifer go home per year, if that, and it was through the courts often. As budgets changed in the California, or the United States Supreme Court actually put a population cap on California, and a huge win in the California Supreme Court by Henry Sanders Lawrence, or by a lady named Henry Sanders Lawrence, allowed the board to start looking more into, is the individual currently a threat to public safety? And what's been found is most people that are serving life sentences are not a current threat to public safety. My greatest concern to date is, will this trend of giving second chances demonstrated by Governor Brown continue under Governor Newsom? It's reflective of, again, over 5,000 life prisoners that have been released with less than a 1% recidivism rate. And often those recidivism rates, or that recidivism is not violent crime, it's for drugs or alcohol or technical violations.
And can you tell us a bit about the work you're doing now with ARC?
So one of the things that I wanted to do when I came home, while I was in prison, I always thought to myself, if I had positive influences around me when I was growing up, would I have changed? Would I have become a different person? I honestly believe that. So part of what I do at ARC, I have teams of mentors that go into juvenile halls, both in the girls' compounds and the boys, and we mentor youth that are facing long prison sentences, that are fighting for what they call their fitness to determine if they're going to be kept in adult court or juvenile court, and we mentor them and prepare them for whatever their life may lead them to. So if they end up in a prison system, we try to make sure that they enroll in college and all the rehabilitative programs. If they end up in a juvenile system, the same thing, we continue to stay in contact and mentor them. We also do a great deal of policy work here at ARC. We've been instrumental in through collaborations with other organizations across the state with changing a number of state laws that deal directly with life sentences, called youth offender parole suitability laws. Those would be Senate bills 260, 261, and Assembly Bill 1308, which basically takes into consideration the youthfulness of the individuals that are arrested and incarcerated, and how they were when they actually committed their commitment offense. I also created the first ever all formerly incarcerated former lifer team that goes back inside the Department of Corrections and literally facilitates rehabilitative programs. So these are men that have done anywhere from 20 to 30 years inside. They came home, they were doing great work in the community. They interviewed for these jobs. We set it up so they're full-time paid employees, and Monday through Thursday they go into 4 maximum security prisons and 3 medium security prisons and facilitate the same programs that allowed us to learn how to change and become the people that we knew we were meant to be and come home and be great citizens.
Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing your story and being with us today. I'm going to have Kerry join in the conversation now. Kerry, if you can share your screen and unmute yourself. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So Kerry, you served 27 years of a life sentence in Louisiana, and while incarcerated, you were the editor of Louisiana State Penitentiary's The Angelite magazine. How did your experience as a prison journalist and your work profiling people in the book, The Meaning of Life, inform your viewpoint on life imprisonment?
Well, that's, as a journalist, it took me 5 years to get to The Angelite when I first came to Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary. And one of the first things I learned, I had no interactions at all with the criminal justice system until I was convicted. And the first thing I thought was, college educated professional. This is not my life. I'm not like this. I have nothing in common. And I had a big awakening, a huge awakening, and a significant education in how the criminal justice system works. And that was the first part. So then I started learning that, Louisiana had, I started learning the history of life sentences in Louisiana, because in Louisiana at the time, and still, except for juveniles and a class of lifers what we call 40-year lifers now, which was only about 130 people. Every other life sentence is still life without parole, mandatory life without parole. So that led, as I learned, Louisiana to have the highest rate per capita of life without parole. And if you look at the numbers now, that Ashley showed it earlier, 30% of the prison population in Louisiana is either serving life sentences or virtual life sentences. And that's an incredible number. So after I got to the Angellite and started and had some good mentors at the Angellite, started writing about the issues that affected us more significantly than anything else. We have a prison with 5,000 lifers. It's a significant number of people. That was 75%, 76% of the population, and so I mean, we lived and breathed it every day around the people we were with. And so the more that we learned, and the more I learned personally, the more I learned that at the time, 49% of all the lifers in Louisiana were first offenders. The most significant class of lifers were over 50% were people convicted of second-degree murder. In any other state in the nation, in Louisiana, that's a mandatory life.
Sorry, Kerry, can you make sure that your microphone is plugged, your headphones plugged in all the way to your computer? You're just cutting in and out a little bit.
I can pull it out and talk. Is that better?
Let's try this for now.
Okay, let's try it this way.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I learned then is, is that the numbers were significant, and Louisiana was doing things. Louisiana's crime rates were not being reduced by any of the public safety measures that were being taken, by any Louisiana's sentencing structure was getting more draconian year by year. Release practices were being curtailed, and again, number of people serving life. Matter of fact, as I started looking back at the history, journalists started researching the history of it. In 1980, 1979, Louisiana created life without parole. At 1980, they had just short of 900 lifers, about 850. In 2017, Louisiana has 4,900 lifers, and it's approaching, slowly approaching 5,000. And that's excluding the fact that now, since 2017 reforms in Louisiana, criminal justice reforms, and the Supreme Court's Miller-Montgomery rulings, juvenile lifers are now eligible for parole, and so is this group of what we call 40-year lifers who originally were sentenced to life with parole between 1973 and 1979, but the parole eligibility was just arbitrarily taken away after life without parole came in. It wasn't done legislatively; it was just done as a practical matter. That was restored. So even with those two groups of about 400, Louisiana still has this extremely high per capita life without parole sentencing scheme. So if you're not fortunate enough now to be a juvenile or fall into that other category, or in one case they had drug lifers or habitual offender lifers, those laws have changed. Most of the drug lifers are now gone, and now that they've changed the laws to become an habitual offender lifer, the bar has been raised significantly. You have to have been convicted of 3 violent crimes, all 3, or they all had to carry a significant sentence. You could not now get a life sentence on a petty crime, a petty felony, a simple theft. But there were people there. There were people serving life sentences, a small number, but still it was adding to the overall thing. So as a journalist, what I started learning more is about the people. So all the things that I found out what happened, because I was now in the same boat. We all thought we were all sinking, and we all had to bail. Had to pick up a can and bail. So to keep it afloat. So I started learning the people, and then I realized that the people were a lot more like me than I ever thought. They were someone's grandmother. They were someone's grandson, or someone's brother, or someone's husband, or someone's son. And they were people who either made it, particularly when you talk about the number of first offenders who were lifers, because it is mandatory life without parole and the only state that actually mandates that on a first offense is second degree. And I started looking at all, and got a lot of stories as a journalist and told a lot of stories, and realizing that this is counterproductive to public safety. Louisiana in particular has had some year after year of budget problems, year after year of budget cuts, and it's affected the prison system as well. And yet, legislature has been reluctant to do anything to change it. But Sam mentioned also the studies. Louisiana has had a study on its lifers who were released through commutation, because that was the only way out, either that or through the courts, and that was a rare issue. So the second degree, going back about 24 years, and the sample was just slightly over 200 people, second degree murder, recidivism rate was 0. So again, it goes back to, we know what the data says. We know everything that the book is saying about age and recidivism rates, and essentially that most people who commit a violent crime are not violent criminals. And we do one of the things I refuse to let any of my writers publish. They loved my red pen when I would do this. I would not let them use the word violent criminal and non-violent criminal. Journalistically, it was a disaster. What I wanted to say was people convicted of violent crimes and people convicted of non-violent crimes, because it more aptly defines. So, you can't really define when you say the word violent criminal, you're not necessarily a non-violent criminal. That's a disservice. You're not really defining that. And as a journalist, I still try to tell that story. You're really not, if that's how you're creating policy based on terms, you're actually doing a disservice to public safety. Because I've met a lot of people who were convicted of violent crimes who are absolutely not violent people, or a singular violent crime that ended them with their ending up in prison with a life sentence. And I've met people who were convicted of nonviolent crimes who necessarily weren't nonviolent. So that happened at the legislature a couple of years ago while testifying on the bill, and one of the representatives from the District Attorneys Association against the policy of changing and reducing sentences. And they said, well, not all of these people who are convicted of nonviolent crimes are nonviolent. And that does work both ways. It's a double-edged sword. Not all the people convicted of violent crimes are violent criminals. You just can't have a one-size-fits-all system has actually done more harm, I think, than anything else. And as a journalist, I have tried to at least bring it out in the certainly I have an advocacy here now, but as a journalist, I certainly just tried to bring out the facts and inform the public of what they don't normally receive, information they would not normally receive through mainstream media, because it just doesn't get covered that well.
Thank you, Kari. So your mic is still cutting out a little bit, so I want to open up the conversation right now for the group to do a Q&A, and I'm going to ask you another question in the Q&A. So if everyone can share their screens, and then a reminder to the audience, we're taking questions using the panel on your right. You can type in your questions.
I just lost mine.
And all right, so we'll do the first question to Kari again. At the Louisiana Parole Project, you work with people who've served long sentences, helping them reenter society. To you and to Sam, what are some of the biggest resources you feel like are necessary? How can we support people who are reentering society after serving long sentences?
Sam, you want to start on that, or?
Okay, housing, definitely housing is a priority. We don't have enough housing in California. 1/3 of the entire prison population comes back to LA County, where I work at. The other one is reducing barriers to careers and employment. Employment is vitally important for a person to be self-sufficient. There are studies that show if you can get a job that pays a living wage within a year of being released, you're less likely to recidivate. It reduces recidivism drastically. And then additional resources such as therapy, if a person was able to tap into that therapy while they were incarcerated, being able to access that therapy outside of prison. I would say those are top two.
Kerry, do you want to add anything? Or?
Yeah, I lost my screen, so if you can hear me.
We can still see you.
Okay. So housing, as Sam said, is probably the first thing. That's significant because, and actually, we pick our clients up at the front gate. We don't want a moment to mean the time that they walk out of there and walk into their apartment. All interested, all time staff, understand the apprehension, fears, anxieties that they're going through the minute they walk out that gate after that client.
Okay. I'm sorry, Kerry. I think we're still having a problem hearing you, unfortunately. But we heard you say you pick them up at the front gate.
Yes. So we do pick them up at the front gate, and we want them to be with our staff from the moment they leave. Mm-hmm. Simply because that all our staff has been justice involved, and that we understand the anxiety, the fears that they're going through, and we want them, that first 72 hours is very critical. First thing we provide is transition housing. But from that point on, everything we may stop. It's about an hour drive.
Okay. The next question is for Marc. How would a 20-year cap on sentences likely impact the size of the overall prison population?
Well, partly depends how it's implemented. We haven't worked out all the data, but when you recognize that the 50,000 people currently serving life without parole, the vast majority of whom will die in prison, many others virtual life sentences will be there the rest of their lives. That in itself would have a significant, very significant impact. And the ripple effects of enacting a 20-year maximum would be significant as well. If we truly wanted a system that was proportional in its severity of sentencing, it would mean ratcheting down the severity of sentences across the board too, if 20 years at the top were to be the maximum. And this could certainly be accomplished without having an adverse impact on public safety. Again, many comparable nations keep people in prison for considerably shorter periods of time than we do in the United States, and have no outbreaks of crime that are dramatically larger than the United States. And in fact, those societies are generally considerably safer than we are. So one could work it out. It's going to vary by state, but it would have a pretty dramatic effect on the size of the population, save enormous resources, and allow for different public safety.
Thank you. Ashley, this question is for you. For the data showing 12,000 juvenile lifers, does that number include virtual lifers as well? And is that still also defined as 50 years or more? Oh, you're muted, Ashley.
Yes, that also includes the people serving virtual life, and virtual life for juveniles and for adults we categorize as people serving 50 years or more.
How do we get people to focus on reducing life imprisonment and lengthy sentences for people with violent crimes when much of the focus around the conversation right now is nonviolent crimes and nonviolent drug crimes?
Well, I could start with that. I think we start by hearing from people like Sam and Kerry, who, been convicted of very serious crimes and clearly are very upstanding individuals doing very productive work in their respective communities. And I'm sure Sam and Kerry would be the first to say that they're not the only ones who've made transformations like this. Those of us who go inside prisons and work with people on the outside know that there are many, many stories like this. And, you know, in many cases, we can all understand that, I think. We can look back to our mid-teen years, most of us, and recognize that we engage in behaviors that we're not very proud of today, that weren't very wise, very smart. Many of us got second and third chances, and so we grew up, we became adults, we took on adult roles. So I think in part by telling these stories and talking about real people rather than soundbite politics is an important way to try to get this issue across, to try to talk about if we care about public safety, we are fooling ourselves if we think that it's only a relative handful of prison population that we need to address. Our vision needs to be much broader, and we're starting to see this happening in a number of states now, reconsidering excessive sentences, looking at earlier possible dates for parole consideration. We're gradually starting to move in this direction, but we have a long way to go still.
The fight to abolish the death penalty has used the existence of life without parole sentences as one of the things used to get policymakers comfortable with getting rid of the death as a sentence. How does that dynamic play out in the effort to end life sentences as a whole?
I can take a crack at that. You know, the death, I think all of us here and are adamantly opposed to the death penalty, and we certainly don't want to interfere with efforts to eliminate it as quickly as possible. We are very unique in our continued use of the death penalty. Other countries have gotten rid of death penalty and also don't use life sentences, and they are doing just fine. So it's important for us to look, you know, sort of beyond our own experiences and see that other countries are able to you know, go beyond just getting rid of the death penalty, but to actually allowing for a meaningful opportunity for release for those who deserve it and for those who we are actively preparing for their release while they're incarcerated. You know, the life sentences are, you know, we just talked about how life sentences and advocacy around revising them and narrowing their use is hampered by a focus on low-level nonviolent crimes as the only criminal justice reform available. It's also hampered by advocacy that promotes life sentences as a humane alternative to the death penalty, when in fact there are much more humane alternatives to the death penalty that we could think of if we put our heads together. It really wouldn't take that much. And a lot of the humane alternative arguments sort of focus on the idea that, you know, if somebody is serving a life sentence, it's pretty easy to get that overturned or get that changed if they are not deserving of that life sentence, when in fact it's very difficult. There are a lot of protections around the death penalty that aren't even allowed for with life sentences and sentences other than capital sentences. So to suggest that, you know, if you're not, you know, if you didn't do the crime or if you don't deserve a life sentence, then that, you know, that fairness will just shake out eventually. It doesn't really turn out that way. And so even with all the problems that we see with the death penalty and all of the injustice that we see around the death penalty, it has all these protections around it. So it makes you wonder how many injustices exist with the life sentences when there aren't nearly the protections.
Can anyone on the panel talk about studies or research on the psychology of individuals sentenced to life sentences and how this can affect their motivation to make changes with no hope to return to their community? I know Sam mentioned trauma in his presentation. I don't know if you would like to start on that, or Ashley.
I can't speak to specific studies, but I can speak to specific instances where my team and I have gone into different institutions throughout the state of California, and never before have we seen former life prisoners come onto a yard, sit down, and actually hold a presentation to other life prisoners telling them that there's a possibility that you can go home, but there's a lot of work that you have to do. Getting out with a life sentence is not easy. You have to go before the parole board. You have to be able to identify your causative factors, what made you make the choices that you made, and make sure that you work through those things. But the hope that you see on the yards now is entirely different because they see this shift. For instance, Calipatria, a maximum security prison, in the year that we've been there, violent 115s have dropped by 100. And when you look at numbers like that, part of it is the hope that comes to the yard when people realize that there is the possibility that I can go home. And part of that is, like Marc says, changing the narrative. I'm not unique in what I do, coming home and giving back to my community. There are thousands of others that are doing just as great work, working with youth, trying to make our communities better, make our communities safer. But these stories of the individuals that return after life sentences are not part of the narrative. You only see the negative side. You don't see the positive side of so much great work that's being done in our communities by men and women who serve life sentences. And I think if we were able to shift that narrative, and you could see, one, the work that's being done, because again, it starts on the inside while you're inside with the rehabilitative programming, and then you come outside, and that'll create even more hope, and then it demonstrates that, one, if the person realizes that there's a possibility that they can have a second chance, it shifts how they approach the world, how they see the world.
How common is it to get people eligible for housing and Medicaid while they are in prison so they have less stress when they leave? Social workers in prisons could be a resource for this.
I agree with that also. So in California, there are two ways to do it. One, they do it inside. There's not enough resources to actually get everyone set up with their Medicaid and Medi-Cal before they're released. But also, Parole includes resources to sign people up as they're being released on parole. So one is there's never enough, because the number of people we have in California is 137,000 incarcerated. And the number that's coming home is huge, so there's never enough. But social workers could definitely, more social workers could definitely play a huge role in helping that, plugging into those particular resources. Because community-based organizations, just not enough, not enough funding to do that.
Ashley, are you still there?
Yes.
This person asked, how do we address the unique needs of women impacted by life imprisonment?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, about 3% of the people serving life sentences are women. And what we know from looking at the juveniles, the girls, is that they have suffered a substantial amount of trauma and abuse before their crime was committed, and that is often related to the crime that was committed, particularly sexual abuse. And so some of the unique needs of women are that they're just, are some of those same needs that we advocate for all corrections, that there be gender-specific initiatives, that there be therapy that's focused on female trauma and sexual trauma that is more prevalent among women. But that isn't to say, I think what Sam contributes is so meaningful. That isn't to say that only women need therapy. I mean, everyone who has gone on and committed a very serious crime has trouble to work out internally. And so it's just that with women, it's more prevalent that they've suffered sexual abuse and domestic violence.
And this is the last question. For people who feel like 20 years is still not enough, what is the response to that 20 years isn't a long time in prison? And anyone can answer.
Well, I'll say, any of us can just think back. Where were you 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? What has your life been during that period? 20 years is an extremely long time. And what is the goal too? Is the goal to get the person in a condition where he or she can come back to the community and still have an opportunity to be a productive member of society. As we mentioned in other nations where it's unusual to have more than 20 years, I think what comes across there is that people think that fairness should be part of the system. So if you're convicted of the most serious crime, you'll get 20 years, and if it's somewhat less, you'll get 10 years, and beyond that, 5 years. That's the fairness part of it, that we're reasonable. What we've done here in the United States is, you can now get life without parole in the federal system for a third-time drug offense. That's what led President Obama to issue sentence commutations to more than 500 people serving life without parole sentences. So I think there's a real difference there between setting up a fair system that's also rational, that's also compassionate too.
I think 20 years. I agree with Marc completely. 20 years is a very long time. I also think that we need to, improve our parole boards, make them more trustworthy, and make them more professional and more polished and less political. And if we do that, there'll be more faith in the parole boards to make, the educated decision about the individual, and less will be left, to those who have been victimized, to have such a heavy vote in whether somebody gets out of prison.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everyone for participating in the call. We really hope that everyone will go out and pick up a copy of The Meaning of Life at your local bookstores. And I also encourage everyone to check out our campaign to end life imprisonment website at www.endlifeimprisonment.org. You'll also find a great short video on our website that Brave New Films put together that features Sam and Kerry. And please follow us on social media using the hashtags End Life Imprisonment and 20 Years is Enough. Thank you again to Sam, Kerry, Marc, and Ashley, and for everyone for joining the call.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.